Palestinian Career Women in Israel, in collaboration with Professor Hawazin Yunus, documents the journeys of Palestinian women medical doctors, lawyers, and high-tech engineers, and applies a critical lens to the idea of diversity employment. Sa'ar's forthcoming article in Current Anthropology draws on both these projects and offers an intersectional analysis of economic citizenship among Palestinians in Israel. We have lots of support across the university for this talk today. So the talk is co-sponsored by James Madison College, the Residential College of Arts and Humanities, the College of Arts and Letters, the College of Social Science, the International Studies program, the Department of History, the Peace and Justice Studies program, the Muslim Studies program, and the Department of Political Science, and also the Office of Institutional Diversity and Inclusion. So lots of support across the university for the lecture this evening. Before we get started, I just want to, for those of you who are here, who are interested in additional events, I want to just let you know about the next 3 events that are coming up. So the next event is on October 16th, and it is the second part of the Leonard Gilman Symposium on Jewish Perspectives on Reproductive Rights. And we'll have a lecture by Gillian Frank about the history of that in Michigan. And then we'll have Lissa Slotkin and Dana Nessel also speaking on reproductive rights in Michigan. Then we're going to have on the 28th, Professor Yossi Beilin, who's also spearheaded the Oslo process and the Geneva Initiative. He'll be here on October 28th talking about his, right in this room at 12:30 on that Friday, on his latest memoir. And then on October 30th, we're having a symposium on the idea of a confederation as a facilitator of the two-state solution with Hiba Husseini and Omar Dajani and Yossi Beilin and Saliba Sarsar and Israela Oron. Trying to see if I'm missing anyone. Hopefully I'm not missing anybody from that symposium. I don't think I am. So that, for those of you who are interested in Israelis and Palestinians and efforts to negotiate a solution, that symposium on October 30th should be really interesting for you. So without further ado, we're honored to have you, Professor Sa'ar. And if please stay for questions after the lecture, and please use the microphone so that those who are live streaming this, and we always have so many more people who are on the live stream or hearing the recording afterwards so that they can hear your question as well. So thank you so much.
Okay. Thank you very much, Yael, for the invitation and for everybody who attended and all of those who are online. So I'm going to talk about recent efforts to increase the economic inclusion of the Palestinian citizens in Israel. And I'll focus about the idea of diversity and some of the paradoxes that come with it. My case study will be Palestinian career women. I'll have to get used to the shining light in my eyes, so hopefully, all right. The idea of diversity, which has been circulating globally, translates slightly differently in different settings, invoking different articulations of otherness. So in Israel, diversity projects refer mostly to Arabs and ultra-Orthodox Jews, as well as to Jews from Ethiopian origin, people with disability, and women in general. I won't go here into an orderly review of who counts as diversity and who doesn't. This is actually a new project I'm just starting on the scales of recognition and redistribution in Israeli society. This talk will focus on Palestinians who are Israeli citizens, and I refer here only to those who are citizens. I know that they are commonly referred to by the Israeli state as Israeli Arabs. Of course,
Having a little trouble hearing you. Let's try that.
okay. Okay, so identity titles are always political, and my choice is to call them Palestinian citizens of Israel. Hold on. So just a background, we're talking about roughly 2 million people who are 21% of the state's population. And I'm only referring here to people who live inside the green line. I don't know how many of you are familiar with the map. So it's the blue part of the map. The green line is the internationally recognized border of Israel following the 1948 Armistice Agreement. The rest of the Palestinians in what's yellow here in the West Bank and Gaza are about 5 million people, and they don't have any citizenship, not of Israel or any other political entity, and I'm leaving them out of this talk. Okay, so as holders of Israeli ID, the Palestinians who live inside Israel enjoy some important individual rights. I've enumerated here on the slide some of them, like the right to vote and get elected and so on. However, and this is part of the Israeli commitment to liberal democracy. However, Israel is also a Jewish state, and that means an institutional legacy of a binary hierarchical structure in which the Jews command exclusive control of territory and government and are entitled to Israeli citizenship whether they actually live in Israel or don't, while the Arab citizens are entitled to rights, are denied rights to national self-identification. And this is, by the way, why Israelis refuse to refer to them as Palestinians. The state instead usually refers to them as minorities in the plural. They largely live in separated residential areas and suffer manifold forms of discrimination. I list here a few of these, of the social problems: high crime levels, poor infrastructure, not too much access to the national economy, concentration in the enclave economy where labor wages are poor and labor rights are not protected. Public services. You can see I'm not gonna read what's on the slide. Now, beside the overarching facts of the root of this is, of course, the defeat of 48, the Nakba, and the fact that Israel is a Jewish ethnocracy. But specifically, what gave Israel the big economic boost was the model of developmental state, which meant direct government interventions in economic development, and a little later also a solid welfare state, all of which were applied nearly exclusively to Jews. The Arab citizens were initially excluded from the national economy entirely, first by locking them under military regime and later gradually by selective admission to lowermost echelons of the national economy, but not to the Histadrut, the labor organization that offered a labor protection that was open only to Jews until about the 70s. Likewise, with respect to the welfare states, the Palestinian citizens were effectively excluded until the mid-70s. Then they were gradually admitted, but 10 or so years later, Israel went into economic liberalization, and much of the welfare state started withering away. So, economic liberalization, which started in the mid-80s and gained momentum in the new millennium, has brought with it contradictory developments. Alongside high poverty levels, I'm talking about the Palestinians, the poor levels of schooling and soaring crime levels, came middle-class, hyper-consumerist lifestyles. As part of that development, new university graduates who were facing blocked opportunities in the national economy offer private health and educational services, further feeding into the rapidly growing local circle of consumption. So, the Palestinian residential areas moved directly from gross underdevelopment to privatized development, what I called market-led development, with minimal state regulation, without the buffer of the centralized state model, which helped people like me, Jews, gain a better education, people like my mother gain protected labor, and so on. The state, for its part, has endorsed this market-led development model, which is in keeping with the overall neoliberal project and helps it meet the requirement of organizations like the OECD and international expectations regarding minority rights. So there's a paradox. There are many paradoxes, but one of them is that it is intriguing that the same governments that opened the door for economic integration and have channeled unprecedented funding to the economic integration of the Palestinian citizens are the same governments that have initiated legislation that aims to take a step further the Jewish exclusivity of the state. There are something like 30-odd new laws and bylaws. I only put here some of them. I'm not going to read them. You can just look at them. The most famous is what's called the nation law. Basic law, Israel is the state of the Jewish people, that passed in 2018, which takes discriminatory principles and upgrades them to the level of basic law, which necessitates a special majority, a majority of the parliament, in order to change. Okay, so this is the background, and how does diversity work on the ground? Economic integration efforts over the past 2 decades have focused on attempt to increase mostly the workforce participation of Palestinians, particularly women, and to encourage business enterprises. Through projects of economic empowerment, diversity, introducing diversity measures in public sector organizations, scholarships for university students, funds for our businesses, and things like that. Typically, the different projects are funded and operated through collaborations between the state, Jewish and Arab businesses, the big Zionist foundations like the Jewish Agency and the Joint, and civil society organizations. The different forms, the different forms of capital, discourse, actors, and strategies that underlie these activities create what Pierre Bourdieu calls a field of cultural production, and what in this particular setting can be called the field of social economy. This is the Israeli version of similar formations in the global north that are commonly referred to as, in the literature, as community economic development. And in my book, well, gosh, don't know, lost track. I have a book called Economic Development. I give a very detailed description of this field. So what's going on in Israel is very similar to what's going on in the global north, which is basically attempts to mitigate the really brutal aspects of capitalism by introducing social solidarity, but not like in the old socialist schemes against capitalism, but within capitalism. And in Israel specifically, the version has particular added value of creating unlikely encounters between grassroots minority rights and social justice activists on the one hand, and state officials, business philanthropists, and professionals of sort of the other, on the other, actors from very different subject positions who don't like usually meet, let alone collaborate on shared goals. Now, if we recall that in Israel, the state and the business sectors are overwhelmingly dominated by Jews, and the political discourse in general is highly antagonistic, we readily realize that in order to operate together, the actors in the social economy field have had to develop a shared language that would mitigate the ideological and identity gaps between them. Thus emerged diversity and other terms such as empowerment, and there's a list of terms. So in 2000, I started doing this series of studies roughly in the year 2000, and in the beginning, I barely encountered the term diversity. Only a few professionals and used it, and people who worked in international, in foundations and were in touch with international donors. Grassroots activists wouldn't use it. For them, it was euphemism. They used political language. They talked about racism and justice and minority right. But gradually, they too started to use the word diversity as a way of being pragmatic, because they understood that it made sense for their partners. So here's an example from an interview I had last year with a Palestinian co-director of a nonprofit that specializes in diversity mainstreaming. And she said, "We've made a conscious decision to stick to business language. When we engage with people in the industry, we emphasize the economic gains they can expect from integrating Arabs. We don't talk ideology. I'm aware that some CEOs and even employees are ideologically motivated. But as far as we are concerned, this is a side benefit, not the main thing." So diversity works because of what it is not. It eschews the old lefty messages of coexistence, or the soft, if less politicized, multiculturalism. It surely doesn't connote the blatant Palestinian identity politics discourse that motivates many of the actors in the field, those who come from civil society organizations. Instead, it resonates the language of business efficiency measured by individual success and contribution, and it is distinctly apolitical, and therefore digestible by mainstream Jewish society. Now, before I go into the study, I just want to say a few words about the fascination with Arab women. This is a very prominent feature of the social economy field and the diversity discourse in Israel, a disproportionate attention paid to women. Now, presumably, it's justified objectively because Arab women are grossly underrepresented in the labor force. Like 36% is an average, right? But when we look at subgroups, for the majority of women is even less than 36%. So younger women are represented at a little higher rates. Academically educated women are much higher rates. However, Bedouin women low, Christian women high, but most of the Palestinian women in Israel are not highly educated. They come from rural communities, and the most likely rate of their participation is even lower than 36%. However, this is not why the discourse is fixated on Arab women. It's fixated on Arab women because of Orientalist fascination, focusing on Palestinians rather than focusing on Palestinians' long-standing structural and political exclusion, populist explanations trace the women's low workforce participation to the traditional patriarchal culture and thus overlooks the role of the state in the predicament. Okay, so the study I'm presenting is a study I conducted with my PhD student, Hawazen Younes. We have a tiny little book in Hebrew, which hopefully will come out in English soon. And we went for the high-end professions. We went for 3 professions, women who do law, medical doctors, and high-tech engineers. We divided it in 3. We had 15 interviewees of each profession, and we divided it into what we called occupational generation. Women who are students, women who are 5 years after graduation, and women who are senior 10 years or more and facing a promotion. Some background about academically educated women. Palestinian women are not new to academic education. What's changed since the new millennium is the scale of the phenomenon. So if you can see that women have been going to university for 4 generations. There are even lawyers, even judges, some medical doctors, old ones. But in the past 20 years and even less, there's been a very sharp increase. You can see some of the figures here, both women and men, but now women are almost double than men in undergraduate levels. It changes in the higher, in the master's and PhD, but women have really, and with this massive entrance, although most women are concentrated in they're either teachers or social services professionals or paramedicals, nurses, pharmacists. However, with a massive increase, more and more women are venturing outside the feminine comfort zone, including into the professions that we studied, and these are the figures for law students, medical students, and engineering students. So you can see that in medical school, among the Palestinian students, women are more than half. There's a majority of women, also a little slightly less, but still a majority of women in law schools. And high-tech professions are still male-dominated, but women are really increasing rapidly also in these professions. Okay, so findings. So we talked to women, right? To the medical doctors, to the lawyers, and to the high-tech engineers in the different ages, so that we could track the changes also in the field. And we found out 2 cultural scripts that inform their experiences. I'll talk about the patriarchal gender contract script very shortly, and then focus on the other one, which is the Jewish domination script. And this is also the one more relevant to the issue of diversity. So the patriarchal gender contract, let me read, otherwise I lose my track, could crudely put the contemporary version of the gender script designates breadwinning to men and care work to women. And although women Women's paid work has become legitimate among different subgroups in the Palestinian society, and even expected and respected among middle-class families. Caretaking remains women's primary responsibility, and this colors the labor force participation with ambivalence. Women get messages that they may be neglecting their children and their homes, that they may be unduly competing with their husbands, and underlying these messages is an effective, subtle message that they may be losing femininity. This gender script affects primarily the domestic work sphere, but it clearly spills over also to the workforce, where women are not trusted that they would prioritize the job when it clashes with their children's needs, where an unspoken assumption that they're not there for the money allows employers to pay them less and to promote them less. And subsequently, they themselves sometimes feel ambivalent regarding competition and entitlement. Now, in the book, we have a lot of ethnography to show this, but I'm not going into this here. I want to go to the second script, which is the Jewish domination script, which is basically, I define it like this, a mostly subconscious schema that informs the way in which Jews evaluate the quality of Palestinians' work. Now, to be clear, both scripts, I'm not saying that I do not want to be mistaken of saying that discrimination is about culture. The scripts are anchored in historical structures of power. So the Jewish domination script feeds on and reflects the Palestinians' structural and political subordination and translates these into values, norms, and intuitive sense of entitlement in various areas of life. In ethnically mixed environments, it means that Palestinians can never meet the standard of the generic ideal worker and face potential devaluation of the work, whether explicit or implicit. In the case of women, more specifically, the Jewish domination script intersects with the gender script to amplify discriminatory practices and symbolic messages. So I'll give some examples. The names, of course, are pseudonyms. Lina, a 34-year-old lawyer who works at a private Jewish law firm, says, "Clients always ask with a big smile if I'm Christian and act surprised when they discover that I'm Muslim. So when I finish working on a case, I always make a point of telling them that I'm not that exceptional. My mom and sisters also went to university, and all of us attended Israeli universities, for that too is an issue. If, for example, they hear that I studied in Jordan, they would immediately run away. So I show them my credentials, the master's degree from Tel Aviv University, and I drop names of important people. I mentioned that Judge so-and-so was a client of mine, or that chief doctor from a hospital. Also, they're smart. They ask you questions that they know the answers in advance to test you. These are routine messages. But then there are special times when political tensions erupt, which happens in Israel every few years without fail. Wars, special military operations, periods of heightened street terrorism, or conversely, the Israeli national days. During such times, aggressive racist talk comes out to the open, including from colleagues who are usually pleasant and friendly. And the women are instantly framed as enemies. Tagrid, 27-year-old electrical engineer, says, "Last year, for example, there was a war, and many of my colleagues have children in the army, so they throw words in the lunch hall." Naila, a 38-year-old medical doctor, described her work in Hadassah Mount Scopus Hospital in East Jerusalem during the 2006 Lebanon War. Imagine a minority woman, an Arab physician who lives in terror, for there's no other word for what I experienced. I had to also deal with the racist discrimination of the Arab patients when they started separating the Arab maternity patients and not giving them any control over the procedure. A patient couldn't even decide whether or not she would receive epidural. Marwa, a 37-year-old electrical engineer, also related to the 2006 Lebanon War. I stayed at home for an entire month. Most of the economy of the businesses in the north were not working. When I returned to the office, I found on my desk newspaper clippings with anti-Arab items. Someone put it under the pile on my desk. Then in the 2014 Gaza war, the racist talk in the office was catastrophic. And these are people I worked with for 11 years. Political tensions recur, but then they pass, and most women keep their heads down until after the storm. Iman, a 44-year-old medical doctor in a hospital in the north, explains, I learned to make a mental switch. When I'm at the hospital, I put the Jewish-Palestinian conflict on hold. Then when I go home, I switch back on. When I started my internship, I realized that I'd be with these people for 6 years. You can't change people. And if you get into a political argument with a doctor or a nurse or a patient, it's a problem. Doesn't matter how much they like you as a person. The relationships will be ruined. I've now been in the same department for 10 years, and not once have I had a discussion or even a conversation about politics. During political outbreaks, I rage within, but I keep silent. It's not that I'm afraid of them. I simply want to work, and I don't want to be uncomfortable in my work. There is no other option. We live here in the state of Israel. I could stand my ground, but then I'll ultimately have to leave because the atmosphere would become unbearable. So I switch off. Besides explicit political discourse, national politics affects the workplace in other ways as well. In higher-end professions, such as the ones we explored, workers make extensive use of their military service connections for networking, recruitment, and promotion, a resource that Arabs, women and men, categorically lack. Alternatively, people use connections acquired through their parents, other relatives, or co-ethnics, which again, most of the Palestinian women we interviewed lacked. In this respect, discrimination is not always easy to pin down or prove. Dunya, a 32-year-old physician, said, I started my specialization together with another Jewish doctor. When we reached the exam stage, the department decided that he could take them and I couldn't. I was pregnant at the time, so I went to my superior and said that I wanted to use my maternity leave to study. You know what she said to me? She said, Dunya, you don't want to take exams, you want to have children. I was so infuriated. I went straight to the chief doctor, but still they wouldn't let me take the exam. And that guy, he had 5 kids. He was allowed to have children. Noor, another senior physician, said, I always felt that they were trying to fail me. We always had to be better than the Jews. There was one senior doctor, for example, who hated me because I was Muslim and not Christian. I didn't have anyone there watching my back, so I'd work like crazy. I wouldn't miss a single detail so as not to give anybody a reason to criticize me. Now, clearly, not all rejections indicate discrimination, and some women admitted that. When we asked her if she experienced discrimination, Shirin, another senior doctor, she said, I never suspected that the senior doctors would fail me because I was Arab. I heard such stories from others, but I personally never experienced anything like it. things went very well for me. And Tagrid, the electronics engineer that who related how her colleagues would throw words, said, I personally didn't feel that they, her colleagues and superiors, were racist. To the contrary, they always helped me. In job interviews, they'd compliment me, emphasize that my good performance was incredible being a woman and an Arab. I always felt wanted. Here note that the same woman can have contradictory experiences, right? I cited the same woman on different experiences, and we all do. And the bad ones don't necessarily color the overall experience. So to wrap up this glimpse into women's practical job experiences, I'll say first that despite the problems and limitations, professional Palestinian women in Israel today, surely those in the lucrative careers, enjoy significant advantages. For one thing, diversity employment policies have given a significant boost to the employment rates. This is very clear when we compare the women from the different generations in the high-tech professions, the older women. 2 of the 5 didn't even try to get a job. They went straight to become science teachers. Whereas the younger women, all of them except one, anticipated a career in their profession. Another obvious advantage is, of course, economic. These women's income level are dramatically higher than the average salaries of Palestinian women in Israel. The lifestyle is typically very busy, but also personally and socially very rewarding, and they enjoy significant social prestige. These women are part of a growing Palestinian middle class where dual-earner families with a small number of children are the norm. They and the families are relatively well integrated in the broader Israeli society. They have valuable cultural and social capital, such as Jewish friends and connections, and multilingual fluency that allows them to switch code between environments. So compared to the society overall, the social and economic situation is very good. At the same time, the minority background means that the familiar stresses of career women that many of you are familiar with, the double shifts, the competitive environment, the work overload, the high expectations, the sexist atmospheres, are augmented by the Orientalist gaze, the covert and overt racism, and by direct or indirect discrimination. For the salaries of most of these women are still typically lower than their Jewish counterparts, and the odds of promotion fewer, and also the overall employment horizon narrower. I have some examples, but I'm going to skip them because I want to get to some concluding remarks. But then again, the more diversity programs are being introduced, we do see signs of change, precisely in high-end professions, such as those that we examined in the study. A few hospitals in the north now have chief doctors who are Arab, all men so far, but one of our interviewees is a department, head of department in a hospital. In high tech, Arabs are still a negligent 4% minority, but the absolute number has risen 17-fold in the past 10 years, and women are particularly sought after by headhunters in this industry. In law, the Ministry of Law introduced affirmative action that boosted the number of Arab lawyers in the system, and some private law firms also, admittedly, they're after the clientele, but they are making moves to integrate I'm talking about big law firms who are based in Tel Aviv. Right, okay. So, some conclusions. The emergence of diversity as a central trope in Israel's treatment of its Arab citizens represents a seeming paradox. On the one hand, it represents mainstreaming of a topic that until fairly recently was regarded explosive and commonly addressed in strong ideological terms by Jews and Arabs alike. As such, it indicates a move of the discourse about the civil rights of Palestinian minority from the very far edges of the political periphery to the center of the political stage. At the same time, the repackaging of collective rights and identity politics. Oh, I'm sorry, I have this. Oh. At the same time, the repackaging of collective rights and identity politics in a language of utilitarian, individualized gains can be read as successful cooptation of a long-standing grassroots demands for recognition and redistribution. Therefore, in my reading, diversity does not represent a paradigm shift in the Israeli citizenship regime. Instead, it represents a logic of economic citizenship. Now, what's that? According to which economic self-sufficiency comprises an alternative path to citizenship, to full citizenship for those who are unable to attain it because they're not Jewish. Theoretically, the idea of economic citizenship, which has traveled to Israel from the United States, opens the door for full equal participation to anyone willing and able to be economically productive, regardless of their primordial identity. However, in Israel, this logic is unsustainable. Instead, the local neoliberal project accommodates a seemingly contradictory combination of economic inclusion policies and draconian exclusionary legislation and anti-Arab public discourse. But the paradox has a more sophisticated, this is a neoliberal paradox, and it has a more sophisticated layer, which we can see when we attune to the women on the receiving end. For highly educated professional Palestinian women, the bargain of economic citizenship is actually attractive, even if they are politically aware of the limitations of the civil belonging. Career paths are intense. All the women we interviewed in all three occupational generations related very high work overloads that they sustained for years on end, starting at university and continuing throughout their careers. Much like most professional women in late capitalism, they rest by indulging in consumer culture, which of course entrenches them deeper into the work-leisure vicious circle. Subsequently, they're too busy and too tired to actively engage in political criticism. As Iman the doctor said, I could stand my ground, but the atmosphere would become unbearable, and I need a comfortable working environment, so I switch off politics. And so, what I called in my title, diversity as a mechanism of depoliticization, is an effect of the neoliberal turn in Israel, more than it is a premeditated action. Yet intended or not, it serves the next stage of the Jewish democratic state, in which the democratic component is reduced to individualistic minimalism and reframed as immersive hyper-capitalist lifestyle, and the legal apparatus meant to mitigate the ethnocratic component is progressively weakened. Thank you. Yeah, I think I'll... move so I can see you.
Hopefully we get some student questions as well. Not to be shy, I can start us off. Thank you for an interesting talk. I wanted to hear more about whether the women are actually less politically active given their role. Because certainly you've shown how in the work environment, they won't necessarily engage in political discussions because they want to feel comfortable at work. They might face a backlash. To lesser degrees in a completely different environment, we might find that in the US that you might not get into a highly political, people maybe shy away from that because they're going to have to work with the people and they don't want tension in those relationships. But it doesn't necessarily mean that when they came home that they might vote for certain parties in which, they might be mobilized in terms of Palestinian group rights and the parties they vote for, or in other NGOs they participate in, or in a demonstration they might go to on the weekend. So I don't know if you collected information as to their political activism outside the work environment.
In these interviews, we didn't address this particular issue, but however, we know personally many of these women outside the interview, and I have long acquaintances with women of these profiles. And I can say that these are, by definition, the activists. Activism starts at university. That's where people become politically engaged. And so in the voting, I would assume that many of these women, some of them I know, vote for the Arab parties. So they are what you call on the Israeli political map, they are hardline left. But they choose not to, they code switch. They code switch on many levels, not only in the language. They have different conversations at work from what they have outside of work. The only exception is some of the lawyers who work in NGOs that are about minority rights. There, it's more natural that the colleagues are also of similar opinions.
Hello. First off, thank you for the talk. Secondly, as you further talking about the idea of the career women finding them needing to code switch away from politics within the workplace, would you as a professional in this field find that there's any real danger of the economic gains that they have made being lost due to a decreasing social situation?
Yes, I think that they're very realistic to switch off. I know some cases. I can relate a case of a very senior nurse who was chief nurse of an entire region, who after 30 years was photographed participating in an anti-war demonstration. She was dismissed. She was about to submit a PhD. The judge of the PhD was a senior person in the Ministry of Health. They annulled she never got the PhD, and she lost everything professionally. And people are very, very attuned to that. I think that there's a really, it's not that every workplace and everything you say, it's not like that, but in public workplaces, yes, the revenge can be very harsh.
You talked about how women, after going to university, are becoming more likely to get hired in higher professions now. Would you say that, like, after going to undergrad, if they don't pursue like higher education after that, they're still being hired at those maybe a little bit lower professional jobs, such as teachers and that still like increases their hiring rate?
Yeah, I think there's a big problem with job availability because most of the Palestinians are concentrated in certain areas, and the job availability there is limited. Commuting is hard for various reasons, And for example, teachers, now it's very difficult to get a position as a teacher because the number of qualified people is way above the available spots. So yes, there's a, I'm forgetting the term, there's a term in sociology that you don't get you earn below your qualifications or your yeah, there's a different, I forget, there's a specific term that you get rewarded according to the qualification. It's a problem because many Jewish-dominated workplaces do not admit Arabs, or the Arabs live far away, and so the options are far from optimal. The privatization helps because there are more private clinics, private educational settings that people can enroll in. But then if it's in the enclave economy, the salaries are lower.
I thought it was interesting that you said that Palestinians are getting access to some of the social services just as neoliberalism has diminished social services. And I wondered if Palestinian career women have the same access to things like childcare that Jewish career women do, and if not, if that might be a source of political activism.
So this is a childcare facilities, that's a big issue. There's a big deficit in high quality childcare and affordable childcare services in the Arab regions. So now this too has been privatized and people are paying for that. This is one of the first factors that are cited to explain why women find it difficult to get full-time employment. In terms of, does this lead to activism? There's a very interesting organization in Nazareth that opened, it's been operative for 30 years, I think. They opened a early age education, high quality, precisely because of that. So there is some activism, but the solutions are mostly private, plus women are assisted by their mothers and mothers-in-law. Now, I'll just tell you, in this respect, I just finished a paper with some colleagues about early retirement. It turns out that part of the reason the rates are so low of labor force participation is that Arab women retire early, on average 8 years before the mandatory retirement age, but in effect, sometimes much earlier. And so we interviewed women to know why they retired. One of the reasons was to take care of the grandchildren, because their daughters are those women that I presented here, who are now breaking through, and the mothers and mothers-in-law are called to assist.
Thank you very much. I asked two questions. One is, can you say if there are any differences? You addressed that in one of your answers about the professions that they have. I know there are studies that show that in hospitals, when there's no conflict, women and men, Jews and Arabs, get along better, and when the conflict is in its peak, then there's more tensions. I would assume that in the high tech or lawyers, even when it's private organizations, maybe the conflict is less there. Excuse me. That is my first question. The second question, if you can compare it to ultra-Orthodox women. It's not COVID.
You know what, I'll answer
Yeah,
this one before I forget.
I'll drink, you'll answer, and they'll ask you.
Okay. Look, I didn't measure. I don't have empirical measurement of where, in what professions the conflict is more biting in the workplace. So I can only say intuitively, or from my familiarity. In Arab hospitals in the north, I live in Haifa. In the north, you go to a hospital, you're treated by an Arab or a Russian-speaking person. Without the Arabs, the hospitals would come to a standstill. Patients can come very weak and debilitated, and their saviors are the Arab doctors and nurses. And so it's particularly painful. We had in May 2021, I happened to escort somebody to a hospital just a day after the ceasefire. It was very painful what happened. They were afraid to even talk. If it's different in law firms or in or high-tech companies are transnational, they are geared outwardly, they work constantly with teams from international teams. So I would assume that this is different. I hope that I will have an opportunity to do research on diversity in high-tech. This is one of my plans. So that's very interesting to test, but I don't know that I can answer that. So what about ultra-Orthodox?
No, ultra-Orthodox women also have this, go to work and at the same time don't feel that they...
You have to stand here, otherwise...
I'll say it again, okay. No, I was asking about ultra-Orthodox women who also go to work, and as far as I know, that also doesn't make a dramatic change in their position in their society. So I was wondering if you can say something in this comparison between these two groups.
Yes, I happen to also finish another project, comparative, about ultra-Orthodox Muslim and Druze ultra-religious women. So, and I'm citing here the work of Michal Frankel, my colleague who's been doing work with ultra-Orthodox women. Ultra-Orthodox women is a very unique case. They come from very traditional societies, gender segregated, patriarchal, but there the prestige goes to religious studies. So the men do religious studies, and the women work to support the families and the men. And by, some of the women work outside the obvious professions of being teachers and nurses or caretakers, and they have businesses. There's more and more information that we have about ultra-Orthodox women in the general workforce, and I think they ultimately don't just go back to the kitchen. It's not as simple as that. Women who are cultivating careers and career aspirations, we are seeing a change in the discourse. I think that we have to look at this change as part of other changes in the ultra-Orthodox Jewish society that is diversifying from within. The main challenge there is access to basic education. And there are, under the radar, there are more and more sub-factions who allow basic education. And so there are changes underway, of which women's workforce participation is part, but I can't say more than that.
Thinking of more questions, as if you could speak more to the diversity within Palestinian women and other Arab women in Israel in terms of Druze and Bedouin and Christian and Muslim, whether your kind of main argument applies to some extent to all, or whether there are some kind of differences among the populations that you might want to elaborate on.
Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you. Of course, when we talk about Palestinian women, we must emphasize that this is a diverse category. And you mentioned some of the main lines of diversity. Religion, the majority, 80%, a bit more, are Muslim. Christians and Jews are about roughly 7% each subgroup. And the Muslims also are divided between people who live in rural communities, in cities, and Bedouins who are semi-nomads. And this is a huge diversity. So the Bedouin women are the least educated and the least employed and the poorest. Christian women that historically were the most highly educated, also represented more in urban areas, but this advantage is now completely irrelevant among academically educated women, because the Muslims are such a big majority, and because they have a broken path into higher education. So now we included in our sample, a third were Christian. And we saw no difference whatsoever in any respect. The religion ceases to be a factor among highly educated women. It is more of a factor among still the rest of the population, because relatively speaking, Christians have less kids and are more likely to be educated than urban. But their numbers are decreasing, both because they have less kids and because they migrate more, and so the proportions are changing. Now, Druze is a different story still. Druzes are Arab speakers. It's a different religion. And they have had an ethnic bargain with the state. The Druze men go and serve in the military. And so, and Druze mostly live in homogeneous communities. Some of them live in mixed communities with Christians and Muslims. And so, Druze have the men have the traditional access to the military, and many of them remain in the military. So, so the economy is different now. In the north, they're also in the Galilee and Haifa region. They also engage in tourism, and Druze women took the longest to get to university, and they have participated in university since the 90s, and the numbers are steadily increasing. But there are still limitations on women's driving, on women's employment outside their villages. Basically, the way it works is that women do drive and do work outside their villages and do go to university, but then they are banned from attending the religious, sort of the mosque or the religious community. It's a very complicated system. But things are changing. We see that in the comparative study that we did, women are entering in larger and larger numbers to university and to the workforce, but the elders, the religious elders of the community are using heavy sanctions to try and prevent that. So.
Question if no one else does. From a very non-expert view, it does seem like economic opportunities often lead to sort of dulled political activism. You see it in Northern Ireland, you've seen it more recently in Sri Lanka. And I just wonder if you've seen examples in the Middle East or elsewhere in the world where you can have the two together, economic opportunity and continued pressure on regimes to change.
That's a very important and big question. In all frankness, I mostly see the capacity of capitalism to curb resistance and to curb critical consciousness, to subdue critical consciousness. I see it on myself. You know, I'm so busy. When will I have time to think critically? So I don't have. I just finished reading the incredible book of Ala el-Aswani, the Egyptian author. His book is called A Republic of False Truths, about the 2011 Arab Spring in Egypt. I highly recommend it. Very pessimistic. So I don't know that we have witnessed with all the waves of the revolts in the Arab world in the early part of the 2011 and those years. I'm afraid I don't see.
I'm sorry I came late to your talk, but I have a question about the actual political views that these women hold in the general Israeli society. As an Israeli, I've been out of the country for a long time, but or not living in the country for a long time, but as an Israeli, it seems that it's less and less legitimate to hold and to practice left-wing politics in Israel. And since you did mention in the part that I did hear in your talk that most of these women do hold more opinions that would be more, let's say, anti-Zionist, and more on the left wing of Israeli politics, maybe they're uncomfortable with expressing these opinions because these are not legitimate opinions in the eyes of most Jewish people anyway. So even if a woman is an Ashkenazi left-wing woman in Israel, she might not be very comfortable expressing these opinions either, and it's not because she's part of a minoritized group, but because her opinions are maybe not legitimate in the Israeli context. So that's one question that I'd like to pose if you have any kind of a view on this. The other part that I'd like to pose is that, again, with left-wing ideology comes the idea of socialism and maybe sharing and more equal income for everybody. How can you play the capitalist game, but also preach the opposite at the same time politically? I think there's a conflict there that's inherent and not necessarily only inherent to their Arabness or to their Palestinianness, but to their positionality politically in Israel.
Okay, so maybe I'll start with the second one. I don't know at what part you came, but the policy of economic integration, as I explained, is implemented through a field of social economy. Now, the concept of social economy, or in the West, community economic development, is a very interesting turn of people searching social justice and more balanced redistribution of resources and inclusion within capitalism. It's a completely different mindset from the old socialism. All socialism, your question is grounded in the old socialist habitus. Mine too. But today, discourses of social justice are, oddly or not, grounded in capitalism. So you see big firms encouraging corporate responsibility actions. And this is a very deep paradox of capitalism. That's how capitalism curbs resistance, including in our discourse, our own discourse of social justice. If you follow social movements in Israel, but not only in Israel, they don't talk anymore about, sociology talks about all social movements and new social movements. All social movements have big schemes. You tumble patriarchy or fascism. New social movements are about self-identification, self-fulfillment, about doing good in the world, and not about, changing the grand social order. And so this is the setting in which the phenomenon is grounded, and it works on people's consciousness. And now whether, to the first question, whether they don't talk politics because they know the anti-Zionist.
Illegitimate.
Yeah.
Legitimate to be
I agree that there's a more and more delegitimization of left-wing opinions in Israel. I would say even demonization. And you see this reflected in political parties who, unless they are really, really earmarked, they completely refrain from identifying. Yes, I completely think but in this respect, it's not the same being minority woman and being, say, Jewish, Ashkenazi woman. because the risks are completely different. So, so the question, why doesn't she speak up, is a very good question. But the odds are different for women of different positions.